Howdy folks, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Yes, that must mean it's Monday already. I'm sorry, nothing I can do about that, but if it's any consolation, I had a great weekend. Yes, I went to Tiger Day at the Tank Museum at Wellington. It's the second Tiger Day that they run this year, and just like the first one, it was sold out. So I think they're probably going to be running more than one Tiger Day every year from here on in. Since they certainly don't seem to have any problems getting the tickets sold. I actually prefer Tiger Day to Tankfest. Tiger Day is a much smaller event. I mean, they'll sell 20,000 tickets for Tankfest, but Tiger Day caps out at 4,500, which is about the limit that they can comfortably fit into the arena. The arena was packed. They can fit more than that into the arena, but you'll be packed in there shoulder to shoulder on Tankfest. With 4,500 people in the arena, which is what they have for Tiger Day, you've got space to lay down a blanket, arrange your stuff around you and get yourself comfortable while watching the arena show. There's just too many people present at Tankfest for you to be able to do that. The other thing that I like about Tiger Day is that while they certainly don't have the same kinds of shows going on in the arena, if you've actually come down to look at the Tank Museum, you can at Tiger Day. Whereas trying to get around the actual inside of the museum on Tankfest, all you're likely to see is the head of the person standing in front of you. So yeah, we like Tiger Day, and I'm glad I made it this time because I missed the first Tiger Day, which happened earlier this year, and unfortunately that was when they were unveiling the Tiger collection. I was sick and I couldn't make it. I was supposed to be there, but I wasn't feeling well. So I'm glad I made it to this one. There will of course be a proper Tiger Day video coming at some point during the course of the week. Right now you're just looking at some of the mostly unedited highlights. And there's a bit of a surprise at Tiger Day this year. It took me completely by surprise. I was expecting to see the usual suspects being put through their paces in the arena. Tiger 131, obviously, because it's Tiger Day. Their Panzer III. The Centurion always gets a run out. The Leopard always gets a run out. You can usually rely on seeing the Mark I Matilda and the Valentine. Possibly the Comet. It's been making an appearance. But this thing, anybody know what that is? It's very similar to a tank, a Tier 8 premium medium tank that you see in World of Tanks. The Panzer 58 Mutz. That's the Panzer 61. It's the tank that was developed from the Panzer 58. Swiss medium tank. Never seen one moving before. Well, we're going to be seeing more of that in my Tiger Day video. Well anyway, while we're on the subject of World of Tanks, well, sort of. Don't worry, you'll see the connection in a moment. Last week I not only went to the Tank Museum for Tiger Day on Saturday, but a couple of days previously on Thursday I headed down to Guildford to the offices of Edge Case Games, the developers of Fractured Space, in order to have a look at a brand new ship that they have coming out. And also, over coffee, we sat down and we had just a sort of abstract chat about game design. More specifically, we were talking about the idea of experience sinks. Ways in which developers of free-to-play games can entice you into parting with cold hard cash in order to skip through parts of their games that, well, aren't particularly fun, or even downright unpleasant. Example time, World of Warships, the Congo, Japanese Tier 5 battleship. What are you talking about, Jingles? The Congo's awesome. Congo is awesome when it's fully upgraded. When you first unlock it, it's pretty damn terrible. Its anti-aircraft firepower is a joke. Its speed is bad. You have to go through a couple of hull upgrades in order to make the thing fun to play. An example in World of Tanks used to be the ISU-152, Soviet Tier 8 tank destroyer. When you first unlock it, it was basically just an SU-152 except a tier higher with worse matchmaking. And you basically had to burn through something like 68,000 experience to unlock the BL-10 gun, at which point the ISU-152 became amazing. Of course, in the last patch of World of Tanks, they've removed that BL-10 gun from the ISU-152, and they've replaced it with a brand new 152mm gun, which is not bad, but it's not as good as the BL-10 was. It still costs an arm and a leg in experience to grind it out, however. And in addition to that, that experience sink, which still remains in a way on the ISU-152 with the new replacement gun for the BL-10, but it also now exists at Tier 9 in the Object 704. It never used to, because you would always unlock the ISU's BL-10 gun at tier 8, and then you could equip it immediately, although I think you may have had to... I'm not entirely sure whether or not a stock Object 704 suspension could take the weight of the BL-10 gun. You might have had to unlock the tracks first, or use an enhanced suspension module, but you could fit that BL-10 gun straight away to the Object 704 at tier 9 as soon as you'd unlocked that. Well, you can't do that anymore, because you no longer unlock it at tier 8 on the ISU. You do get the ISU's replacement 152mm guns. It's not quite as bad, but you've still got to grind out something like 60,000 experience in order to get the best gun on the Object 704. So it used to be the case that you'd unlock the ISU 152 and think, well, alright, stock it's not that great, but I'm going to get this amazing gun that's going to make me the terror of the battlefield in any tier 6, 7, 8, 9 or even 10 match. But it was going to cost you an arm and a leg in experience. Well, they took that gun away and they gave you another gun that's almost but not quite as good. And you still have to grind out an arm and a leg's worth of experience in order to get it. However, you always had the satisfaction of knowing that once you'd unlocked that BL-10 gun at tier 8, you could just stick it straight onto the Object 704 at tier 9 without having to go through a painful grind. But now you do have to go through a painful grind, because now you won't have unlocked that BL-10 gun at tier 8 on the ISU 152, and so you've got to grind through tens and tens and tens of thousands of experience at tier 9 as well in order to unlock that BL-10. So you went from having a horribly nasty experience sink, but with a good payoff at tier 8 and tier 9, to having two pretty nasty experience grinds at tier 8 and tier 9. Or you could just put your hand in your pocket, convert some free experience and skip through the grind entirely. Now, at this stage we're only talking about modules on tanks that need to be unlocked, or can be unlocked with free experience in order to make the tank or the ship or the aircraft, if you're playing World of Warplanes, a bearable experience. But what about those vehicles that just suck regardless of what stage in the upgrade process you have them? Even fully upgraded, they're still absolutely terrible. Now, I'd argue that a prime example of this is the American Tier 4 medium tank, the M3 Lee. I know that the M3 Lee has its fans, but they're weird. they're just masochists. Oh, but Jingles, the M3 Lee's got the damage per minute of a Tier 6 tank destroyer. Well, yeah, but it doesn't have the penetration or accuracy of a Tier 6 tank destroyer, and it certainly doesn't have the concealment value of a Tier 6 tank destroyer. Yeah, the gun isn't bad, but everything else about the tank is. And the thing about the M3 Lee that makes it a particularly good example is the fact that it's Tier 4. See, Tier 4 is where the grind really begins when you're playing World of Tanks. Up until now, it takes no time whatsoever to grind your way through the modules and unlock the next tank a tier higher. But when you get to Tier 4, and suddenly it's not something that you can actually do in an hour anymore, the way it was at Tier 3, or half an hour at Tier 2, or 10 minutes at Tier 1. You actually have to start putting some effort in and playing a whole bunch of games in order to get from Tier 4 to Tier 5. And you're in a tank that absolutely sucks. It's not just the tank itself, it's the matchmaking. You're now starting to face Tier 6 machines. Tier 6 machines like the SU-100Y that can one-shot kill you. In fact, just about anything with a 122mm Russian gun can one-shot kill you. And so the experience of playing the M3 Lee, not just stock, even fully upgraded, can be absolutely horrific. I'll put my hand up right now and tell you that when I first started playing the M3 Lee, I was aware of the reputation that it had, and I thought, nope, it's not the tank, it's the players. I'm going to make this thing work. I've heard all about how good the DPM of the gun is, so I thought to myself, challenge accepted, and I think I lasted about 4 games before I admitted defeat and just skipped right through to the M4 Sherman at Tier 5 with free experience. I just couldn't take it. It was too painful. I bought the Sherman, I sold the Lee, and I have never re-bought it. I've never been tempted to have another go and see if I could actually make that thing work. The experience was just too horrible. Another prime example, German Tier 6 medium tank, the VK3001P. Stock, that thing is an absolute disaster. It is the size of a Tiger, but it doesn't have the armour of a Tiger. Its guns are pretty bad, And the speed, technically it has a very, very good top speed, but its acceleration is a disaster. Here's what happens if you try to accelerate in the stock VK3001P. You put your foot down on the accelerator, and the accelerator writes a letter to the engine requesting more speed, and then sends it by second class post. A couple of days later, the engine gets the letter. Unfortunately, the engine can't read, so the engine has to ask the transmission for help. Eventually, the engine realizes that the accelerator is saying, "More speed, please," and starts thinking about making the tank go any faster, and it doesn't get that much better when it's fully upgraded. The guns aren't too bad, but everything else about the tank just sucks, even fully upgraded. At some point you've got to stop and ask yourself, have these tanks been deliberately made as bad as they are just to entice people to convert free experience and skip through the grind, rather than having to suffer through playing these absolutely terrible tanks? I was looking through the tech trees in World of Warships, and I don't remember anything being as unrelentingly horrible in World of Warships to play as the VK3001P and the M3 Lee, as just two examples in World of Tanks. I mean, the Pensacola, American Tier 7 cruiser, used to be, well, a bit of a disaster as well. And yet, bad though the Pensacola was, I actually quite enjoyed playing it. I don't know, maybe I'm just a bit perverse like that. I mean, the guns were very good. It had exceptionally good armour-piercing ammunition, and it was pretty quick, but it had no armour whatsoever. It was made out of citadels, and it could be detected from a range that was just ridiculous. Well, they've gone ahead and buffed the Pensacola a couple of patches back, and they've reduced the range at which it will be spotted. So it does actually make it quite competitive now. It's still got no armour, and it's still made out of citadels, but it's still got those good 203mm guns with excellent armour-piercing shells. So it's not really that bad. It was the same with the Colorado at Tier 6, the American battleship. They used to say that whichever team had the most Colorados was going to lose, and it really was just a terrible, terrible ship. But, well, they went ahead several patches back and removed a lot of the hull upgrades for mostly the battleships in World of Warships. The hull upgrades that were basically experience sinks. They didn't really give you anything, but you had to spend experience in unlocking them so you could get to the decent hull upgrades. Well, that's gone now. And the Colorado, its guns are still pretty terrible, but they're big and they're powerful. It's got a lot of them. And it's a tough ship. It can take a beating. It's not that bad, really. It's certainly not the kind of ship where you'd think, I can't take it anymore. I have to just blitz through this with free experience. There are certainly better American battleships that you could be playing, but grinding through it to get to the New Mexico at Tier 7 it's nowhere near as painful as it used to be. You could argue that some of the lower tier British cruisers are experience sinks, and to a degree you'd be correct. I mean, the Caledon isn't particularly good. The Weymouth is certainly nothing spectacular. The Danae isn't that... well, it's not that bad, but it's certainly not that good. But these are just Tier 2, 3 and 4 ships. It takes no time at all to get through them. If you don't like playing them, you don't have to play them for more than an hour before you've unlocked the next ship in the tier, and you can just move on. So they're not really that much in the way of experience sinks. The whole idea of these deliberate experience sinks doesn't really seem to be as much of a thing in World of Warships as it is in World of Tanks. On the other hand, you might say, well, actually, Jingles, have you had a look at the Japanese Tier 9s? Yeah, okay, fair enough. The Isamu, the Tier 9 battleship, 178,000 experience to unlock that thing, and, well, let's just say it's difficult to play well. We'll leave it at that. We'll be generous and say it's just difficult to play well. Not only that, once you've unlocked it, you've got to grind through all the modules on it, which isn't cheap, and then come up with a further 250,000 experience in order to unlock a battleship that is actually very good, the Yamato at Tier 10. And the Japanese Tier 9 cruiser, the Ibuki, has armour that is so bad it gets overmatched by every battleship it's ever going to face, even the Tier 7s. They can just... all they have to do is hit you, and they're going to do damage. You will not bounce a shot from a battleship, ever, if you're in the Ibuki. So... but it's just the armour on the Ibuki that's bad. You know, everything else about the ship is actually quite decent. So, yeah... What do you think, anyway? What particular tanks in World of Tanks and ships in World of Warships have just defeated you, where you've said, nope, sorry, can't do it, can't take it anymore, and you put your hand in your pocket, bought some gold and converted free experience in order to get past the just utter horror of having to play those things for a minute longer? While we're still on the subject of World of Tanks, there's a new patch under test at the moment, patch 9.20.1, and the British tanks, specifically the heavies, mediums and tank destroyers, are getting some love. In a nutshell, the mediums from tier 8 up to 10, so the Mark 1 and 7 Centurion and the Centurion Action 10 are all getting buffs to their turret armour. The FV4202, as well as getting buffs to its turret armour, it's also getting a bigger engine. In the heavy tank line, the Conqueror and the Carnarvon at tier 8 are coming in for a bit of love as well. The Carnarvon in particular is down for some radical changes. They're actually turning it into a heavy tank instead of a very, very bad medium tank. Because that's what it was. Those 20-pounder guns, they're the kind of low alpha damage, high DPM guns where you just have to keep the gun firing in order to do any kind of damage with them. The problem with the Carnarvon was the armour was terrible, the speed was terrible, and it was huge. You could get away with that kind of gameplay in a medium tank because you're not as big and you've got the ability to duck back into cover if you start to attract attention, but you couldn't do that in the Carnarvon because it was huge and slow. So what they're doing with the Carnarvon is they're turning it into a little bit more of a heavy tank. I mean, the hull armour is still absolutely terrible, although apparently the side armour is getting a little bit of a buff. I mean, you're still going to be able to penetrate it if you shoot it in the side with just about anything, but it should be able to give you slightly more options when you're side scraping with the Carnarvon. But the front of the turrets, well, more specifically the turret cheeks, are getting anything between 20 to 30 millimeters more effective armour. But the big change is coming in the gun selection. It's getting a 32-pounder gun. Now, it's not a huge alpha damage gun, but it does more damage than the 20-pounders. And you don't have to pay off too much of a trade-off in accuracy and reload time in order to fit that 32-pounder gun. The Conqueror at tier 9 is also getting some changes. More specifically, the turret is being made a lot tougher. The current top turret on the Conqueror is going to become the stock turret on the Conqueror, and it's going to get a new top turret. As well as having thicker armour, it's also going to have spaced armour around the turret cheeks. I don't ever recall seeing a picture of a Conqueror with spaced armour on the turret, but whatever, you know, I'm past complaining at this point. Also, the upper glacis is receiving an effective armour buff. The lower glacis is going to be just as paper thin as ever. I don't think it's getting any kind of buffs to the side armour, and it's having its mobility and rate of fire reduced in order to compensate for the increased armour protection. All of which brings us on to tier 10 and the FV215B, and there's some big news coming with regards to the FV215B. It's being removed. Well, it's not being removed, but it's no longer going to be a tier 10 heavy tank. It's, I believe, probably going to become a tier 8 premium instead, and they're replacing it with a brand new vehicle. And it's not the Chieftain. No. Despite the fact that the Chieftain does exist as a tier 10 British heavy tank on console, despite the fact that the Chieftain model has existed in the game files for years, rather than giving us a tank that did actually exist, they're making more shit up. And they're giving us a Super Conqueror. What the hell is a Super Conqueror? I have no idea. Apparently it's a very, very heavily armoured Conqueror development with a powerful gun. They haven't actually released any stats for it yet. It's probably going to be good, but well, it's not a Chieftain, is it? So, anyway, they're going to be going into greater detail on the stats of the Super Conqueror at some point in the probably very near future, although it wouldn't surprise me if stats have been data mined at this point, and you can always look them up and find out what the provisional, at least, stats of this new mythical Super Conqueror are actually going to be. There are more changes coming in for British tank destroyers, specifically the alternate line that culminates in the shit barn, the FV4005, the one that nobody likes. Just to summarise, the Challenger is getting a bigger gun with better alpha damage. The Charioteer at tier 8 is getting 10 degrees of gun depression on its 105mm gun. The Conway is also receiving a new gun, a 5.5-inch gun with more alpha damage. It's also getting a mobility boost and the 10 degrees of gun depression that you get on the Charioteer. And the shit barn, the one that nobody likes at tier 10, it's getting several buffs. It's having its ammunition capacity increased to 20 shots. The gun itself isn't changing. but the vehicle itself is having its mobility buffed. It's also getting 10 degrees of gun depression, same as at tier 9 and 8. So I guess we're going to find out whether or not these changes are enough that we're suddenly going to start seeing more of the British turreted line of tank destroyers on the battlefield. Are these changes enough to make them actually fun, rewarding, and interesting to play? Other changes that we can expect in the next patch include buffs to the tier 10 light tanks. The American auto-loading light tanks are, well, they're not being buffed, but they're receiving alternate guns that you can use instead of the autoloaders. I don't have any details on the exact guns that they're receiving, but I would expect them to be single-shot regular reloading versions of the existing autoloaders. Finally, some of the premium tanks are receiving a couple of buffs, including the Type 59, which is receiving gun stabilization and aiming time buffs, which should make the tank a heck of a lot better at A, firing on the move, and B, hitting targets immediately after it stops moving. There are some changes for the 59 pattern, which is having its armour piercing penetration increased to 212mm, and the T-34-3 is having its armour buffed to bring it on par with the Type 59. So that is pretty much what you can expect in the next patch for World of Tanks. All of which is rapidly bringing us to the end of this episode of Mingles with Jingles, which must mean it's story time with Uncle Jingles. Over the last month or so, I've been recounting some stories from a book that I've been reading called Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It's the organisation that would become the Special Operations Executive, basically Britain's Department of Dirty Tricks in World War II. It's not that Germany didn't have any intelligence agencies during the Second World War. They did. That was kind of the problem. They had too many of them. And as with so many other things under the Nazis, they all competed against each other rather than worked together. German intelligence estimates of the kind of forces that their army were facing in every theatre of operations universally got it wrong, sometimes drastically so. In North Africa, for example, it was estimated that Rommel's Afrika Korps, after the battles around Gazala, were facing no more than 8 to 10,000 British and Commonwealth troops, when in fact they were facing 38,000. On the Eastern Front, their intelligence estimates were usually far, far worse. They underestimated the number of Russian troops they were facing around Moscow by a factor of 4. They underestimated the number of Russian troops that were facing in the First Battle of Kharkov by a factor of 6. And their efforts to insert agents into hostile territory were universally terrible. For a totalitarian militaristic state like Nazi Germany, it was comical at how bad they were at running secret agents outside of their own territories. Not one agent successfully managed to infiltrate Britain, for example, and their attempt to start a terror campaign in America in the summer of 1942 was equally a spectacular failure. Operation Pastorius was dreamed up by the Abwehr, the Wehrmacht's secret intelligence service. The plan was for 8 Germans, all of whom had lived at some point in the USA, to sabotage a number of targets with homemade bombs. From the start, it was a complete disaster. The team leader, George Dash, managed to leave compromising documents on a train, while another of the group got drunk in Paris before they set sail and began boasting that he was a secret agent. When they did finally reach American shores via a U-boat, they were immediately spotted by a local Coast Guard. Rather than killing him, they bribed him to keep his mouth shut, whereupon he did the sensible thing, pocketed the cash, and then hurried off to report to his superiors what had happened. It then turned out that both Dash and another of the team, Ernst Berger, had confessed to each other that they hated the Nazis and they wanted to compromise the mission. Berger admitted that he'd spent a year and a half in a concentration camp. How he was ever selected for this mission is hard to imagine. Not only did they spill the beans to the FBI, they also handed over $84,000, Pastorius' entire budget. The team were quickly rounded up, tried and sentenced to death, Dash and Berger included. These 2 later had their sentences commuted, but on the 8th of August the other 6 were all sent to the electric chair. It's difficult to think how such an operation could possibly have been handled worse. I mean, seriously, they recruited anti-Nazis from a concentration camp, gave them $84,000 and said, off you go, set some bombs off in America. Just, I mean, really? I can think of any number of different ways where that was just always going to go wrong. Well, anyway, finally this week, because we don't often talk about German war heroes from the Second World War, mostly because it's difficult to find ones that weren't Nazis. But I've been reading a new book lately. It's by an author called James Holland. It's called The War in the West, A New History. It's in 3 volumes, although so far he's only written the first 2. I've finished the first volume, and I'm about halfway through the second one, and there's some fascinating stories in this book. In particular, I'm talking here about a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who was part of Jägerschwader 27, 2 sections of which had been based in North Africa, fighting with Rommel since 1941. His name was Joachim Marseille, 22 years old, the son of a general. He was a brilliant fighter pilot, but he was a little bit of a maverick. He had a bit of a problem with authority, not a particularly sensible trait to exhibit in Nazi Germany as a whole, and the Luftwaffe in particular. His repeated insubordination and breaches of discipline had gotten him kicked out of 2 squadrons already, but he finally found a home in Jägerschwader 27 under Hauptmann Ed Newman, who treated him with a bit more understanding and latitude than his previous commanders because he was such a fantastic pilot. By the beginning of May 1942, he had 52 victories to his name, as well as a Knight's Cross and a Cross of Gold. By the 16th of May, he was up to 60 kills, and every single one, except a lone twin-engine Maryland, had been an RAF fighter plane. This really was an exceptional score. In Russia, Luftwaffe fighter aces had been getting even bigger personal records, but a large number of those victories had been won against inferior aircraft flown by poorly trained pilots. Royal Air Force fighter pilots, on the other hand, were all very well trained and most were highly competent. They were also flying fighter planes that were mostly a cut above those of the Russians at the time. At any rate, fighters were harder to shoot down than bombers, and as Captain Newman had recognised, Marseille was a truly exceptional fighter pilot, possibly one of the finest ever. He had extraordinarily good eyesight, which enabled him to pick out enemy aircraft before anyone else. He was a superb shot, unnaturally good at deflection shooting, aiming ahead of the target, with an uncanny precision, so much so that he rarely used more than 5 or 6 cannon shells to bring down an aircraft, and about 15 or so machine gun rounds per kill. Marseille was also one of the very few pilots who continually trained as hard as he could, and that meant exercise too. Running, and particularly sit-ups to strengthen his stomach muscles, which he'd realised was important when you were handling G-forces. As a result, Marseille could pull a tighter turn and therefore handle more G-forces without blacking out than most other pilots. Early on the 19th of May 1942, he was flying a free hunt with his wingman, Rainier Potkin, when they spotted 7 P-40 Kitty Hawks below them. Diving down, Marseille hit one, damaging it, then followed it down and closing in, opened fire again at a range of about 200 yards, hitting the plane in the engine. The Kitty Hawk was finished, but Marseille watched the pilot manage to land it safely, then jump out and run for it. Marseille waited until the man was clear, then returned and strafed the aircraft until it burned. You see, Marseille loved flying, and he loved fighting, but he hated the idea that he was killing people. The very first aircraft he shot down, which was about 2 weeks after Eagle Day in the Battle of Britain, was a Royal Air Force Hawker Hurricane. And it was while watching this Hurricane go down in flames that he realised that this wasn't a technical exercise anymore. People were being killed. He wrote to his mother, "It does not sit well with me. I keep thinking about how the mother of this young man must feel when she gets the news of her son's death." So while he was merciless in the air, he always tried to avoid killing wherever possible. Early on the 30th of May 1942, Marseille and his 4-aircraft flight attacked a formation of British fighters from 250 Squadron and 450 Royal Australian Air Force between El Adem and Tobruk. Picking out Flight Sergeant Graham Buckland, one of the Australian pilots who was turning into a shallow climb, Marseille fired off a burst and crippled the plane. He then watched Buckland bail out, but his parachute never opened and the man fell to his death. Marseille was horrified. It was his 65th victory, but he made a note of the coordinates and after landing back down, headed off in a vehicle with his wingman, and soon found the body, which still lay where it had fallen, behind German lines. The wreckage of Buckland's Kitty Hawk was a few hundred yards away. Collecting Buckland's papers and confirming his identity and unit, they then hurried back to the airfield. There Marseille climbed back into his Messerschmitt and flew back over Allied lines before swooping in low over 250 Squadron's landing ground and dropping a bag with Buckland's things and a note he had written. Once clear, he climbed and headed back to base. It wasn't the first time Marseille had done this. He was something of an idealist, a man fighting a war that was quite different to the one almost all the other combatants were fighting. His number 14 Messerschmitt was known by both sides. After Rommel, he was already the most famous man in the North African theatre. For him it was a duel, in which honour and respect for your enemy was an essential part of the fighter pilot's role. He was also obsessed with death and the thought of the men he had killed never being found and their mothers and families not knowing what had happened to them. And this he hadn't changed a bit since his first victory. Before too long, Marseille had notched up his 101st confirmed victory and promptly been awarded both the oak leaves and swords to his Knight's Cross, the 12th German serviceman to receive this honour. He was immediately summoned to Rastenburg to receive the award from Hitler in person, but he didn't want to go. He didn't want to leave his comrades, and he didn't want to be parted from his new friend, Matthias, a black South African that had been captured in Tobruk. Since then, Marseille and Matthias had been best friends. Ostensibly, Matthias had become his soldier servant, but Marseille never thought of him in such terms. Rather, he called him the best friend and bartender one could wish for. Upon arriving at Rastenburg to receive the award from Hitler, he was asked by one of Hitler's staff officers if he'd ever considered joining the Nazi Party. Marseille replied that if he saw a party worth joining, he'd consider it, but there'd have to be attractive women present. When Hitler told him that Germany would need men like him when the war was won, Marseille said to him that he thought neither he nor most of the men he served with would still be alive by then. On the 31st of August 1942, during the Battle of Alam Halfa in the North African desert, Joachim Marseille shot down 17 Royal Air Force fighter aircraft. Just think about that for a second. That's in one day. Most World War II fighter pilots who weren't butchering poorly equipped and badly trained Russian pilots during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa were lucky if they managed 17 kills during the entire Second World War. Later, however, on the 6th of September, Marseille lost two of his best friends in the squadron on the same day. He and Fifi Stahlschmidt had been especially close. He was last seen going down with smoke trailing from his engine, pursued by 3 Spitfires, but although Marseille went out to look for him, he couldn't be found. Marseille was distraught. Despite his astonishing 17 victories in one day, he was clearly struggling. He'd always had difficulty sleeping, but now, when he was finally able to rest, he'd begun to sleepwalk. It had started soon after his sister had been murdered in Germany 9 months earlier, but in North Africa, as his own scores rose and more of his friends were killed, so the sleepwalking increased. He was so mentally and physically exhausted that he often needed his friend Matthias, the black South African, to help him out of the cockpit. Matthias would get him to his tent and put him onto his bed as though he were a child. Marseille had been awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, but he barely acknowledged it. After Stahlschmidt's death, he retreated further, eating alone and chain-smoking. It was clear he was burned out and he needed a long rest, but there was no chance of that happening while he was still shooting enemy planes out of the sky and while the Luftwaffe was so short of pilots. On the 26th of September, he was flying yet again, one of 9 Me-109s from his squadron, ordered to escort Stukas. Just before 5 p.m. that afternoon, as the Stukas were making their dive-bombing run, he spotted 6 Spitfires climbing to intercept them rather than the Stukas, something they rarely did. Calling out a warning and flying on over the Spitfires, then suddenly rolling into an almost vertical dive, leaving his comrades behind, something he often did, he met the first Spitfire almost head-on, fired, and the enemy plane broke apart. The Spitfire's wingman hurtled past, but Marseille pulled back the stick, half-rolled, and then cut the throttle, extended the landing flaps to enable him to pull a tighter turn, and cut in on the Spitfire's own turn. Opening fire, he saw the Spitfire burst into flames and fall away streaming smoke. He now climbed again, clear of the smoke, and then heard a warning of a Spitfire below at 9 o'clock. Throwing the Messerschmitt over hard to the right, he pulled back into a dive as the third Spitfire banked away to the left, but continued to climb, exposing its underside. Marseille fired again, riddling the Spitfire, and saw it plunge towards the ground. That was 3 down. Immediately, however, he came under attack in turn from the third Spitfire's wingman. The Spitfire and bullets were coming straight towards him, so Marseille rolled and dived, then pulled up once more and looped as he tried to get onto the Spitfire's tail. What followed was some 11 minutes of aerial duelling as Marseille in his Messerschmitt and the highly skilled Royal Air Force pilot in his Spitfire turned and pirouetted around the sky. Eventually they sped towards each other, less than 300 feet off the ground, and each opened fire. Both slewed their aircraft to avoid being hit and hurtled past each other. By now Marseille's fuel light had come on. He needed to shoot down his pursuer or get out of the fight and get home quickly. Climbing up into the late afternoon sun, he now hoped to use it as a blind and get away, but the Spitfire had turned to follow and was starting to close the distance when suddenly his plane erupted into flames. At the same time, Marseille finished his climb and cut the engine before rolling and diving back down onto the Spitfire's tail. At just over 100 yards he opened fire, saw the Spitfire's wing rip off, and then the remains of the aircraft plunge into the ground. It was his 158th kill. By the time he landed back down again, Marseille was so exhausted he almost fell asleep as the engine cut. Soaked in sweat, with his hands trembling, he could barely get out of the plane, and he needed Matthias to help him. Only when he was told he was finally being given some leave and sent home to receive his diamonds did his spirits seem to improve. 3 days later, on the 30th of September, Marseille was flying another sortie over enemy lines using a brand new Me-109 G2 when he suffered engine problems, and radioed in to say he had smoke pouring into the cockpit. "I'm blinded," he called out. "Can't see a thing." With two of his comrades drawing up alongside him, they escorted him back across their own lines, by which time Marseille was struggling to breathe even with his oxygen mask. Back on the ground, Hauptmann Neumann, the group commander, now called him up and ordered him to bail out. "I have to get out now," agreed Marseille. "Can't stand it anymore." Releasing the canopy, he flipped over the plane and dropped out from 1,500 feet. But as he fell, the nose of the plane fell forward, and he was struck by the stabilizer on the tailplane, which knocked him out over on his back before he could open the parachute. Seconds later he hit the ground. The Star of Africa, as he'd become known, was dead. He was only 22 years old. A wartime pyramid was built by Italian engineers at the site of his death, but over time it decayed. On the 22nd of October 1989, Hauptmann Edward Neumann, who survived the war, and other squadron survivors in cooperation with the Egyptian government erected a new pyramid that still stands there to this day. He's actually buried at the Heroes Cemetery at Derna Memorial Gardens in Tobruk, and his gravestone bears just one word: undefeated. And that is it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.